Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Bloomsbury House. It's nice to see that the instructions reached you and you arrived here rather than at Arundel House. Welcome. Our event today is the launch of Asia's latent nuclear powers, Japan, Korea, and South Korea and Taiwan, by my colleague Mark Fitzpatrick, who's head of the Non-Proliferation Disarmament Program at IISS, and recently, at the end of last year, relocated to Washington, D.C., so he's Executive Director of ISS Americas. That's the right rebrand, right?
Right.
Asian nuclear proliferation questions are never far from the news, most recently with North Korea, the gift that keeps on giving. But it's interesting and I think very important when we look at that, and when we look also at China's nuclear strategy, as we did recently in the Adelphi book, Paper Tigers, by another of Mark's collaborators, to consider some of the Asian states that are on the threshold of nuclear power, exactly how close they are to a breakout, and what the circumstances might be to occasion such a move. This is precisely the subject that Mark has written on. And without further ado, and as he really needs very little in the way of introduction, I hand over to him.
Thanks very much, Nick. Thanks for coming over to the Bloomsbury House. Sorry, it's kind of small quarters here. As most of you know, I have spent most of my time over the past decade when I was here in London, looking at the outlier states. Iran, Pakistan, North Korea, Syria, you might say the problem countries in the proliferation realm. But future proliferation is not necessarily limited to the so-called rogue states. It could also occur among insider states, friendly countries, America's allies. I was talking once with Iran's former ambassador to the IAEA, Soltanieh, and I told him my project was involving looking at Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. Oh, he was so excited about that his country wasn't the only one of my attention. All of the states that the economies, let's call them economies, or let's call them democracies, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. If political science theory held true, all of them would be nuclear armed by today. Actually, long ago, they would have acquired nuclear weapons, because they all have the supposed motivation. They face adversaries that are powerful and that are nuclear armed. In the early part of this century, I recall predictions that if North Korea were to go nuclear, it would be a game changer for the region. There was a prediction by one American political scientist that by 2016, there would be 6 states in Northeast Asia that would be nuclear armed. Well, it didn't happen. North Korea's nuclear test in 2006 did change the taboo in Japan about discussing the possibility of nuclearization. But it didn't make most Japanese want to get nuclear weapons. They could just talk about it. Only the right-wing fringe actually advocated nuclearization. In South Korea, North Korea's ongoing testing program has had a bigger impact among the population. And there's more of even among centrist strategists and thinkers in South Korea, there's more of a call for indigenous nuclearization. But still, the government is firm in its support for non-proliferation stance. The key reason Japan and South Korea did not go nuclear over these years was because they had an alternative means of protection. They had the U.S. alliance. They could rely upon Washington for protection. So the question I ask in my book is, will this situation continue? I conclude, if anybody has to leave early, the bottom line is yes. The 3 will remain latent nuclear powers. Latent means they have recessed capabilities. If they wanted to, and they didn't care about reactions, they could, each of these cases, build nuclear weapons in perhaps 2 years if they really put their backs to it. And in the case of Japan, as little as 1 year, because Japan already starts with having the uranium enrichment and plutonium reprocessing capabilities. Japan and South Korea also have rocket launch technologies and even more sophisticated missile programs in South Korea that could be adopted for warhead delivery vehicles. Whether Taiwan would have it or not is a question that I explore, and maybe they don't. All three of the cases I explore also have a history of pursuing nuclear weapons. In the case of Japan, it was when Japan was a different country, an imperial Japan during World War II. It pursued both uranium enrichment and plutonium reprocessing, but quickly ran out of time and material. Both South Korea and Taiwan explored it in the 1970s due to security concerns and concern about U.S. abandonment. Both were stopped by Washington, and both went on and tried it again. They made a second attempt. In the case of Taiwan, they pursued it over 20 years before it finally stopped. It wasn't extinguished until a well-placed CIA mole in the Taiwan nuclear establishment defected to the United States, brought all the plans with him, and then there was a political change in Taiwan from an autocratic system to a democratic form of government. South Korea terminated its program in 1979 when Chun Doo-hwan, taking power after the assassination of Park Chung-hee, needed legitimacy of the American relationship, which he wouldn't have had if he'd continued down South Korea's the nuclear path pursued by Park Chung-hee. So, and then after that, South Korea also changed, became more of a democracy, a very vibrant democracy. The free press and the openness of government in Taiwan and South Korea today and in Japan over these decades means that none of these could pursue nuclear weapons in secret. The money that would be needed would be debated in the parliament, and so if they wanted to do it, it would have to be an open process. Japan's nuclear posture is unique in many ways. It's the only non-nuclear weapons state to possess both of the two forms of sensitive nuclear technology that are the paths to nuclear weapons, uranium enrichment and plutonium reprocessing. Also, I contend that in Japan's case, it's not just nuclear latency, but it's a quasi-hedging strategy. Hedging you can define as latency with intent. They not only have the recessed capabilities, but one of the reasons they have the capabilities is so they could have a weapons option in the future. That's hedging. Now, I say quasi-hedging in Japan's case because the capabilities were developed and maintained primarily for civilian use. Nuclear hedging for security purposes was a secondary purpose. Also, it was a means of diplomatic leverage. Several times over the years, when Japanese leaders felt particularly threatened by China or other events, they would talk about the potential for nuclear weapons option in order to get Washington's attention, and Washington always responded by strengthening its security commitment. Many in South Korea want the same capabilities that Japan has, the enrichment and plutonium reprocessing. And in their case, the primary motives are also economic, but they have also a political and an emotional reason to want these technologies, because they don't want to be denied what Japan has. There's also a quasi-hedging strategy when many South Koreans talk about these technologies. As one former U.S. government official told me, when the South Koreans talk about pyroprocessing, which is a form of plutonium reprocessing, they have in the back of their minds a weapons option. I contend that the expansion of these sensitive fuel cycle technologies, uranium enrichment and plutonium reprocessing, is probably the greatest proliferation threat that the world faces today. As some scholars put it, who I quote in the book, nuclear latency is the new nuclear proliferation. And that concern is why the United States said no to South Korea when they wanted advanced consent for pyroprocessing in last year's so-called 123 agreement between Washington and the United States. And South Koreans asked the question, well, if they can't have it, why did the United States allow Japan to have these technologies? And the answer is a historical accident. Japan got its foot in the door before the United States changed its policy on reprocessing in 1976 when Jimmy Carter was elected, but even before him under Gerald Ford. The policy was to oppose the spread of these technologies, but Japan had already invested a lot of money in it. And for Japan, keeping this technology was a condition for signing the NPT in 1970. So in 1977, Jimmy Carter reluctantly accepted limited reprocessing for Japan. And then in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan removed the restrictions, allowed Japan to have a full reprocessing program because, in his view, Japan's anti-communism was the most important foreign policy objective for the United States. And as well, Japan had a spotless non-proliferation record. I contend that Japan ought to abandon reprocessing. That doing so would be Japan's greatest contribution to global non-proliferation. I don't think Japan's going to do that, but there is a debate in Japan about whether it's really needed. And given that Japan's nuclear power industry is not going to recover after the Fukushima disaster, that only maybe a third of its power plants are ever going to come back online, it's a legitimate question to ask, do they really need reprocessing? The answer is no. They could get everything they need from the international marketplace, except that they have political constraints. Local governments, where the reprocessing plant is located, they've threatened that if reprocessing is not continued, they won't allow spent fuel to be stored at Rokusho. And then where's Japan going to put the spent fuel? No local government wants the spent fuel in their municipalities. So getting back to the theme here, Ronald Reagan said, okay, you can have full reprocessing because anti-communism was so important. So South Koreans ask, well, what if a Ronald Reagan type candidate were elected to the U.S. presidency this year? And every Republican Party candidate sees himself as Ronald Reagan-like, even though they're hardly like him. And my answer is, don't bet on it. That non-proliferation has been such a consistent theme of U.S. foreign policy over the years that no U.S. president would quietly want any of its partner countries to walk out of the NPT. In Japan's case, they weren't a member yet. It was a condition for them to become a member. In South Korea's case, abandoning the NPT would lead to the unraveling of the treaty. It would be a huge slap in the face of the United States. No U.S. president would stand by and allow that. And even if Donald Trump might think it might be okay, whoever he would appoint for his Secretary of State would know that wouldn't fly. So, aside from the U.S. political election cycle, other recent developments provide a useful context to my book. So one of them is, of course, North Korea's ongoing nuclear and missile testing program and the impact that has had on the South Korean body politic, and I'll get to that in a little bit. Also, last month's election victory in Taiwan by the independence-leaning Democratic Progressive Party could increase cross-strait tensions in a way that, under classic political science theory, could increase any motivations that Taiwan might have to go nuclear in the face of the graver threat they face and the threats that the mainland China has made. and in my book, I don't think Taiwan is going to go down any nuclear path. They haven't talked about it for 10 years. Nobody publicly has suggested it. But there are some underlying currents that I found in Taiwan that I wouldn't put it out of the question entirely that Taiwan might go down such a path. But the country that is the most likely among the three cases that I looked at is South Korea. It's because of the proximity of the threat that the South Koreans face from nuclear-armed North Korea, and because the non-proliferation norm in South Korea is so weak. It's surprising when you look at it. You ask South Koreans in successive public opinion polling, and 2/3 of them say, yes, we should have nuclear weapons. Now, there's a little bit of a trend that it's maybe less than 2/3, might be 60% now. One recent poll even was 55%, but still, the fact that over 50% still say they should have nuclear weapons in successive polls suggests that they could go down this path. The government, though, remains firmly attached to non-proliferation, but it's worrisome that even leading members of the government's party, the parliamentary leadership, has been calling for South Korea to go nuclear. And the reasons they say it's of leverage. They want, I don't know if they really want to go nuclear, but they want the leverage to try to persuade China to put pressure on North Korea and to persuade North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons. But, looking at this, I think it would be a total negative for South Korea. Their economy would suffer. All of the fuel for their 29 nuclear power plants and all of their other reactors that produce medical isotopes and so forth would go without fuel because the fuel comes from foreign partners who condition the supply of the fuel on it being only for peaceful uses. So by contract, by law, they would have to cut off the supply of nuclear fuel. It's the same in the case of Japan, in the case of Taiwan, in America's and France, Australia's other partners. So South Korea's nuclear industry, hundreds of billions of dollars of investment would be at risk. And South Korea's 4 nuclear power plants that they're building for the United Arab Emirates, they would have to stop that project. South Korea's desire to be a leading exporter of nuclear technology, they would have to say goodbye to that. And then there's the security risk. If a country starts down a nuclear weapons path, and they can't do it in secret, remember, so their adversaries would learn about it right away, there would be a period of vulnerability for that 2 years period before they could get it, and a period when their relationship with the United States would be threatened. Henry Kissinger told Park Chung-hee in the 1970s, if you continue this nuclear weapons pursuit, say goodbye to the American security commitment. So American partnership would be at risk. And you'd be vulnerable to adversaries. I think Russia and China would naturally target any South Korean nuclear weapons facilities as a matter of course. And then the nation's international standing would be jeopardized. So I have an op-ed, I think, in today's Korea Herald lining out these arguments against nuclearization in South Korea. But when I was in Seoul last week doing a book launch like this, I had some very lively discussions, and there still is a very strong body of opinion that they need to do something because they feel that America has not stopped North Korea. America was supposed to prevent North Korea from going nuclear, and America failed. So it's a question about credibility of America's promises, security commitments. Now, I think there's a difference between deterring North Korea from ever using nuclear weapons and preventing North Korea from obtaining capabilities to begin with. And I'm pretty certain that the commitment on the deterrence end of it is still absolutely strong, that America's pivot to Asia it means what it says, that America is in Asia to stay, that the commitments are strong with its allies, and the fact that President Obama didn't follow through with his red line commitment when he said that if Syria used chemical weapons, that would be a red line. And that sometimes is posited as an example of how you can't rely on American promises. Or some in Seoul and Tokyo will say, well, America couldn't stop Putin from grabbing Crimea. But these are not allied states. America doesn't have an alliance with Ukraine or with the Syrian rebels. An alliance commitment is a firm commitment in the case of two very staunch allies in Northeast Asia. And Taiwan is not exactly an ally. There's no legal commitment to go to Taiwan's defense, but there's a de facto commitment in Washington. Taiwan is seen as a good guy that needs protection, and the Taiwan Relations Act, which calls for America to help Taiwan with its defense, would, I think, persuade most Americans that they would need to assist Taiwan if its hour of need were at hand. And Taiwan's hour of need, you can imagine circumstances where it would be at hand. The defense spending disparity between Taiwan and the mainland is 17 times, and it's growing larger every year. The Taiwan Ministry of National Defense anticipates that by 2020, the People's Republic of China could launch a full-scale invasion that would overwhelm the island's defenses. Now, Beijing doesn't show any signs of readying such an invasion. But in the lead-up to last month's elections, there was some pretty harsh language coming from Beijing. President Xi Jinping issuing ominous warnings about a deterioration of cross-strait relations if the winners did not accept the 1992 consensus that there is but one China. And the victorious DPP party led by Tsai Ing-wen doesn't agree with that formula. So I think Taiwan's security future has some clouds in store. Now, looking at the other cases, and I'm sorry, I'm jumping around a bit. The South Koreans are convinced, many of them, that Japan is just a matter of time before they get nuclear weapons. And they say, look at what Prime Minister Abe is doing. He's undoing all of the defense constraints that have binded Japan over the years. Most recently, changing the law to allow Japan to have collective defense arrangements. But I contend that, yes, although Shinzo Abe is making Japan a normal country in its military posture and its defense relationships, that doesn't mean that Japan is going to go nuclear, because normal for almost every country, save 9 in the world, normal means non-nuclear. And Japan is attached to the non-nuclear policy. And the Japanese people, unlike the South Korean people, have an aversion to nuclear weapons that's been constant since the end of the war. Japan is worried about growing strength of its main adversary, China, worried both about China's nuclear modernization and even more so maybe about China's conventional capability increase and China's growing assertiveness in the maritime regions that are close to Japan and territories that Japan claims. But again, as long as Japan can rely upon the United States, and the United States has strengthened its security commitment, Japan is not going to go down a nuclear road. And the United States has strengthened this commitment in various ways, including by a dialogue on nuclear deterrence, an extended deterrence dialogue, which gives Japanese policymakers the same insights that NATO policymakers have had over the years of knowing how the nuclear deterrence works, what the timing is of when you start signaling about nuclear use. They've had tabletop exercises, and it's been instructive that before they did these exercises, there wasn't a clear understanding of when you start kind of raising the possibility of using nuclear weapons. So this kind of a very clear exchange of information, bringing Japanese officials to the the bases where nuclear submarines are based, where the strategic airplanes are based, and the missiles and so forth, gives the Japanese a very strong sense of the commitment is firm. And the same dialogue has been established with South Korea. They call it something else, but again, the same very close exchange of information is a manifestation of America's security commitment. When I was in South Korea last week, they kept the people who wanted nuclear weapons of their own. They'd ask me, "Well, what can America do to show that it's going to be here?" And I would go through this litany of the deterrence dialogue and all that. They said, "No, we want something more firm." And I said, "Well, look, one of the things America did was to change the restrictions on South Korea's missile." What South Korea is allowed in terms of the distance of its missiles, and America kind of, we had I'm an American. I used to be an American official. I forget that I'm not an official anymore. America had a limit on South Korea's missiles, but they relaxed that to allow South Korea to be able to hit anywhere in North Korea with the conventional missiles as a way of giving South Koreans a sense that yes, they can defend themselves. But some people want more than that. They want tactical nuclear weapons stationed again in South Korea. That's not going to happen. No American military commander wants tactical nuclear weapons back in South Korea. They were pulled out in 1991. They wouldn't give any capabilities that America doesn't already have with its strategic forces. And they're vulnerable to being preempted, and they're vulnerable to terrorism or to other. Securing them just takes a lot of effort that no American commander wants. So American tactical nuclear weapons in the region aren't the answer. Indigenous nuclearization is not the answer. Maintaining a credible U.S. security commitment alliance relationship is the answer. I think that is the answer that is going to prevail in the foreseeable future, but I am a little bit worried about the trends in South Korea. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Mark, thank you very much. You've covered a great deal of ground very efficiently there. And even those who came here wondering what a Donald Trump presidency would look like will not have left disappointed. We have no microphones here, but we do have a tape recorder. So if I may, I will then repeat the question back for the record. So really there's a premium on brevity and making it simple enough that I can understand it. So you're the first person to catch my eye.
Andrew Barlow, member of the Institute. Mark, one thing you didn't mention at all, which slightly surprised me, is the steps that the US is taking to provide these three countries with some sort of missile defense. Do you think that is an important component of the US showing that it's not abandoning these countries in the face of the problem? And what impact does it actually have on opinion in those countries?
Right. Thanks. Oh, so you're going to repeat.
Well, just the question concerned U.S. missile defense policy and then the impact on these countries' stance towards nuclear questions.
So I do cover this in the book, of course, and the issue is most relevant in the case of South Korea, which has been facing this debate about whether they should introduce the U.S. THAAD missile defense system. And there's been opposition to it because China has been leaning so heavily on South Korea to dissuade them. Russia also. But most recently, South Korea made the decision, and correctly so, I think, to enter talks, formal talks with the United States on introducing THAAD. I argue in the book that this will be an important means of strengthening America's security commitment, strengthening the credibility of the commitment, because THAAD is part of a global U.S. missile defense structure, each part of which is not reliable in itself to be able to knock down all of the missiles that an adversary might launch. But combined against an adversary like North Korea, which would have a limited number that they could launch, against the United States. They might have 300 missiles that can hit South Korea, maybe 200 that could hit Japan, but against the United States they would only have, less than a dozen. Missile defense can be relatively confident that they could knock out most of them. So if North Korea knows that they wouldn't be able to hit the United States with any reasonable confidence level, then they are deterred by denial. Deterrence by denial, I think, is a very important part of America's defense commitment. So the question that South Koreans ask, like the one that de Gaulle asked when he said, would the United States trade New York for Paris? South Koreans sometimes ask, would the United States trade Los Angeles for Seoul? That question doesn't even arise if North Korea can't hit Los Angeles because THAAD helps to prevent it. So I'm not sure that's probably not the way South Koreans, they mainly think of THAAD for their own defense, and that's also important. But I think it plays both purposes. It helps defend the country, and it helps prevent any questions arising about decoupling of America's security commitment. Yes.
I, as member, Vipul Thakur. Mark, you clearly mentioned that Pakistan and Iran are rogue countries. But I think probably China is much bigger rogue country than others. We see that in the South China Sea, it has started introducing fighter jets, missiles, and radar equipment. And gradually, I think, one step at a time, China is creating facts on the ground. In my opinion, unless the US responds vigorously at each stage, then maybe there might be doubts in the minds of governments in Japan and other countries, and they may be pushed, especially Japan, might be pushed to acquire nuclear weapons irrespective of strong commitment that US has. What do you think?
Okay. So the question concerned whether perceptions in the three countries that Mark talks about of a rising and more active Chinese foreign policy might ultimately change some of their nuclear calculations.
Right. This is a good question, and it's primarily relevant in the case of Japan and China and the standoff that they face, including over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. And the concern in Japan about Chinese gray area incursions, gray area meaning provocations that don't necessarily rise to the level of an armed provocation, but that are sort of incremental slices of salami. And there are scenarios that worry the Japanese about Taiwan, landing so-called fishermen on the Senkaku's Diaoyu Islands, which are military in disguise. And how would the United States respond to this? And President Obama, I think, addressed this importantly when he said that the Senkakus fell under the area that's covered by the U.S. security commitment, because it's an area that's administered by Japan. So it's not that the United States is going to go to war with China in the event of such a gray area incursion. The Japanese would have the primary first responsibility, and they are well equipped to do that, and they're strengthening their capabilities. That would be the Coast Guard to begin with. But the United States would assist with intelligence information and with the backdrop of being there for Japan should any should any conflict escalate. And it's that backdrop. In the latest U.S.-Japan security dialogue, they refer to it as seamless defense commitment or seamless deterrence. That there's not a sharp distinction of when conventional or subconventional becomes conventional or conventional becomes strategic. That one has to look at these kind of issues seamlessly and scope out how to respond to them. And the dialogue between the United States and Japan is so intense and deep on these areas that I don't think the Japanese are too worried about the United States not being there. But some of the people who aren't part of this dialogue, and similarly in South Korea, those who are not part of the dialogue worry about the extent of the commitment. But those who know it know that it's there.
Yes, please.
It's Masato Kimura, Japanese freelance conservation member. I would like to have a question about 3D, distance and deterrence and denial in the terms of this side difference. The U.S. government can assure Japan and South Korea in the same level of security in the time of missile defense. So we don't have a distance, and so I doubt the capability of missile defense, for example, denial. So U.S. can assure the same level of security to Japan and South Korea and Taiwan.
There's a question concerning some of the differences between U.S. security guarantees to the three states, particularly as regards to Japan, partly as a result of the lack of strategic depth.
Yeah, in terms of missile defense, it's not the same for the three economies that I look at, because the United States does not have a missile defense systems in Taiwan the way they have had with Japan, and that are increasingly the case in South Korea. The distance issue is one that's relevant because South Korea is so much closer to a nuclear-armed threat, and I think that South Korea is going to have to, and they know it. They know they need to strengthen the missile defense. They probably need to add some of the Aegis ship capabilities that Japan has. There's only so many Aegis ships, though, that are equipped with missile defense systems, and the United States has to station them where most needed. But at least they have the advantage of being flexible in their deployment. And so even in the case of Taiwan, they could be deployed there, although I imagine that could create some difficulties with mainland China. I'm not sure I understood the full meaning of the 3Ds question, but
the United States has a distance and deterrence and also denial.
Well, obviously because of geography, I don't think it would be. Nobody would say that the same level of missile defense could be applied to countries that have such an immediate geographic threat. The United States has the advantage of being so far away, and so there's more time to shoot down any incoming missile. But I don't think that undermines the deterrence. I mean, you do what you can, and deterrence is not only missile. I mean, missile defense is just one component of deterrence, and deterrence is not just nuclear deterrence. It's not just a nuclear umbrella. It's the political commitments, economic ties. I think the Pacific Trade Treaty is also part of the economic ties that bind the economies together and that make the United States committed to the region.
Okay, I have Desmond Bowen and Matthew Cotti on my list, and time for more, but first Jonathan Paris, please.
I can go last.
No, come on.
Well, you mentioned at the beginning of your speech, Japan has a hedging strategy, which reminds me of another country you're following probably more closely than anybody in the world. That's Iran. That Ayatollah Khamenei has a hedging strategy, a latent strategy. I wanted you to perhaps outline an optimistic scenario whereby that hedge would be, in financial parlance, lifted and put away down the road. What sort of scenario could you see where they would lift the hedge?
Thank you, Jonathan. That allows me to talk about one of the themes that I talk about, it particularly in the introduction and then in the Japan section. So many times when I was discussing the nuclear issue with Iranian interlocutors, they would say they just want to be like Japan. They just want to have enrichment capabilities like Japan has and be allowed to have as a great of enrichment program as they want. They clearly had a nuclear hedging strategy in mind when they were talking about that, and it wasn't just for peaceful use. They saw that Japan had a nuclear hedge. So what would lift that hedge? Maybe the question is what would make people like you and me feel less worried about it? One answer is that if if Iran truly were like Japan and had a spotless record of never having any violations of its safeguards agreement, of never having any evidence of having worked on nuclear weaponization, of having a society of openness where I'm convinced that if Japan went down a nuclear weapons road, that internally the scientists involved would blow the whistle. They couldn't do it in secret. I'm not convinced that would be the case in Iran. So if Iran were to evolve in ways that made it more open, democratic, and committed only to peaceful uses, then that veil of hedging, we could live with more easily. But I don't see that happening in Iran in the foreseeable future. So in 15 years, when the Iran deal is lifted, now I'm getting away from the theme of my book, but I am worried about when Iran is allowed to have a full enrichment program, unless they're at the stage more of like a Japan country without violations. And maybe in 15 years, without any violations, well, we'd have more confidence that Iran would honor the commitments.
Desmond Bain, please.
Mark, I wonder if you could say something about China and what China sees its responsibilities to be. Clearly, the vital nature of the U.S. umbrella is central to this. But to what extent does China see that they have a role in terms of the way they behave and the way they develop their nuclear capability, the extent to which that impacts the three countries in question, and whether there is a sense of restraint there at all?
Okay. In case that hasn't got into the record, the question is concerning China and whether it sees it has a role in keeping these states the right side of the nuclear threshold.
Yeah, that's that question has come up repeatedly, and it comes up in different contexts. Most recently, the issue is why don't the Chinese understand that by not restraining North Korea, they are contributing to the mood in South Korea toward weaponization? And shouldn't the Chinese realize that if South Korea were to go down that road, that would not be good for China's national security? And doesn't China realize that when they yell and scream about THAAD being introduced in South Korea, that they could have prevented it by leaning on the North Koreans? Don't they understand that? And the answer, as you know, is that the Chinese give a greater priority to not doing anything that might create instability in North Korea. And I guess the Chinese thought that they could put pressure on South Korea to prevent THAAD introduction, and that they can rely upon the United States to prevent South Korea from going down a nuclearization route. The question also has come up with regard to Japan. During the early part of this century, officials such as Dick Cheney and others in the White House and then in the American security community often would talk about the Japan. They played the Japan card. They would say, China, if you don't rein in yourselves, you could encourage Japan to go nuclear. So be careful. Don't do that. This to me was the worst thing that Cheney and company could have said, because it implies that they would be okay with Japan going nuclear. And I interviewed one Japanese strategist who said, if the United States signaled that it would be okay to go nuclear, that would be the strongest impetus to Japan to go down a nuclear route. So playing the Japan card can really backfire. And it didn't work anyway, because China didn't rein in its modernization. Although China's nuclear capabilities can be exaggerated, often are exaggerated. Nick mentioned at the beginning the Delphi book on China, Paper Tigers.
Jeffrey Lewis. Yeah.
Jeffrey Lewis's book. And Jeffrey examines in detail how much plutonium China could have produced, and assesses that China doesn't have more than about 220, 30 nuclear weapons, and there's a limit to how much, and that they don't have the same sense that America and Russia have of needing larger arsenals. But still, China's gradual modernization and expansion to nuclear-armed submarines does have an impact on Japan's security thinking.
Matthew Cotty, please.
Thanks, Nick. Matt Cotty, working in the market, my boss. My question is about the sustainability of latency. So you mentioned Japan and the fact that only a third of reactors are likely to come back online. Taiwan, the recent presidential elections, I believe the winner had an anti-nuclear posture in terms of civil nuclear infrastructure. So I'm wondering how the potential for declining nuclear industry in the region plays out with regard to maintenance of that capability or that latency. Are there any concerns longer term about declining nuclear industry and capability maintenance?
Yeah, thanks, Matt.
The question concerned whether the wind down in nuclear industry, civilian power industry in some of these countries would affect the ability to sustain a latent nuclear potential.
So that's most obvious in the case of Taiwan, where, as you said, the soon-to-be governing DPP is totally opposed to all forms of nuclear. And in fact, the population is anti-nuclear. So the 4 nuclear power plants now in operation are going to be phased out in the very near future. And so Taiwan soon will not have any nuclear power, and the latency will be sharply diminished. Now, you can have latency without nuclear power plants if you have other nuclear reactors that could be put to plutonium production purposes, and if you maintain a cadre of skilled engineers and scientists. And Taiwan will have to maintain such a cadre because decommissioning of plants takes so long. So the latency will not evaporate, but it will be diminished as Taiwan pulls out of nuclear power. The case of Japan is more complicated because they're not going to pull out of nuclear power entirely, even though the majority of the Japanese population says that they should in public opinion polls. But not all the. Some of the nuclear power plants are coming back into operation. Probably only a third of those 54 that operated before Fukushima Daiichi disaster are going to be back online. And the question is, will Japan need to maintain the reprocessing capability and the enrichment capability? And I argue no, they don't. But they're probably going to because of the political issues involved. And because of a latent hedging strategy. Former Defense Minister Ishiba talked about Rokkasho being a technological deterrence, clearly meaning that they should keep that capability for future option should it ever be needed, as a rainy day option. And many in Japan think he shouldn't be talking about that. And in fact, in this hedging strategy that I see pretty clearly, a lot of Japanese say, no, there's no hedging strategy because we don't talk about that much. It's just understood among a lot of them that they don't need to talk about it. It's there, and I think they're going to maintain it.
May I ask a follow-up question on that, Mark, a very brief one? Because you highlight in the book Japan's reprocessing capability so far in advance of really what it needs, particularly in the post-Fukushima circumstances, and you call for Japan publicly to end reprocessing. Is that simply for the signal it sends to the rest of the world in terms of the non-proliferation regime, or is part of your concern that simply, despite Japan's safeguards and the way it is structured as a state, a very effective and secure one, nevertheless, that stockpile could just become too tempting a target for nuclear theft?
No, it's primarily the former. It's primarily as a part of a global non-proliferation objective that sensitive technologies should be restricted and eliminated where they're not needed. I'm not worried about. Oh, I got to be careful here. I am a little bit worried. I mean, because it does give Japan a capability, and as a non-proliferation purist, I should be a little bit worried about that. But one thing that's interesting. A lot of people talk about Japan's mountain of plutonium, the 47 tons of plutonium. It's not separated, but they could separate it if they built a reprocessing plant, if they used a reprocessing plant. That's enough for 2,000 or so nuclear weapons. But it's reactor-grade plutonium. It's not what you would use for weapons if you really wanted to have weapons that were reliable, and it's not the way Japanese put their minds to things. But there's other plutonium in Japan that is more useful for nuclear weapons, and I point out that there are 86 kilograms of super-grade plutonium that were produced back in the 1970s and later at two reactors, Joyo and Monju. That super-grade plutonium, even more pure than weapons-grade plutonium. And so if Japan wanted a nuclear weapons option, that's the path they would take. They would use this 86 kilograms. It would be enough for 20 weapons or so. And they would build a small reprocessing plant. And they would put their space launch vehicles to other uses. And I mean, I'm not revealing any secrets here. And most people in Japan don't know about these 86 kilograms. And I think that Japan should send back these 86, not send back, they should eliminate this super-grade plutonium to remove any hint or possibility of weapons use. Japan is doing something very admirable in that before the March 2016 Nuclear Security Summit in Washington, Japan is returning to the United States a couple hundred kilograms of plutonium and highly enriched uranium that had been in Japan for many years for what's called a fast critical assembly. And this is material that could be used for weapons, and it's U.S. origin. They're sending it back, and that's admirable. But then there's this other 86 kilograms that's not U.S. origin. That Japan produced it itself. Nobody talks about it. I think they should talk about it. I think they should get rid of it.
And you can read about it on page 95 of the book. Yes, please.
Okay. As a government official of Japan, I should say that what you say should be crap, but it's quite interesting for the discussion. But I have one very question about the nuclear deterrence, extended deterrence theory. Why Japan or Japanese policymakers believe in extended deterrence, whereas Korean policymakers don't necessarily take it? Is it about difference of the educational process, or is it about the purely circumstantial issues, or it's something else? That I'm interested in the difference of the reception of the extended deterrence, which is being differently accepted.
Thank you. So the question was about differences in Japanese and South Korean belief in U.S. extended deterrence.
Okay, so thank you, Minister Osumi. I should make it clear that today South Korean policymakers do believe in the credibility of U.S. extended deterrence, and I don't see any difference between today's South Korean policymakers and Japanese policymakers in their the strength that they give to the U.S. Extended deterrence. And also, by the way, public opinion polling shows that South Korean public commitment to the alliance is strong as ever in both countries. I mean, it's in the 90 percentile. And I remember, having been in South Korea at times of anti-American demonstrations, it's nice to see that. The left doesn't have this anti-American attitude anymore in South Korea. But among some of the population, the fact that they would want their own nuclear weapons is de facto evidence that they don't believe in the credibility of the American deterrence if they think that they should have it themselves. And so you might ask, why is that? Why is there that difference? And I think it maybe comes down to the proximity to the North Korean threat. And but it also maybe it's because in the South Korean case, it's not, even though they believe in the credibility, they don't have the same aversion to nuclear weapons, and so they kind of the idea that maybe they should have another option. They're more willing to accept the idea that they should have another option.
In proximity, I understand that point. But at the same time, South Koreans believe that North Koreans will never use nuclear weapons against South Korea because they are the same people.
Some South Koreans, as you say, believe that North Korea would never use nuclear weapons against them because they're the same people, but I don't think that's necessarily the prevailing attitude. I mean, the South Korean government certainly thinks that North Korea would use nuclear weapons against it. And when you think about the different ways of delivering nuclear weapons, missile defense could prevent North Korea from hitting some other adversaries, but North Korea could put a nuclear weapon in a artillery. I don't know if they could get it small enough for artillery, but they could put it in a nuclear submarine and in a submarine, a mini submarine, and if it was a suicide mission, that to me is maybe the most credible way that North Korea could deliver. But they couldn't get that submarine to Japan, probably. They could get it to South Korea.
Gentleman at the back.
Nuclear weapons are one thing, credible delivery systems are another, particularly if you're a small, densely populated country. What do you think are the possibilities and the timescales that the associated with this country?
A question about the development of nuclear-capable and reliable delivery systems.
This is a good question. And it's precisely why over the years, whenever Japanese strategists in government or outside government examined the question about going nuclear, they always came up with the answer that because Japan is a small country and doesn't have a strategic depth and doesn't have the submarines that would be necessary, it would be inadvisable. Every study came up with that conclusion. And so delivery systems, the absence of delivery systems were one of the answers. I don't think it's fully the answer because you look at the case of Israel. They don't have any strategic depth. They have nuclear weapons, and they have submarines that apparently are nuclear armed. And Japan could have similar submarines. They wouldn't be the super silent submarines. They would have to be diesel powered for the time being. But they could use them in a stretch. Japan could conceivably put missiles in the mountain areas, but which population would allow that is another question. In the case of Japan, it's not the constraints on going nuclear aren't just technical. They're political and legal and institutional. Those constraints are probably greater in Japan's case.
Final question goes to you, sir.
My question is about North Korea, because the old problem that you mentioned, the cause is North Korea. North Korea has a big economy and limited means to develop. So how far you think that North Korea can go in the nuclear power? And the second question is that in the last nuclear explosion, North Korea claimed that was a hydrogen bomb, which was denied. What's your opinion?
Okay, so questions: how far can North Korea's nuclear program proceed, and what was the most recent explosion?
Right. So, we in our latest IISS dossier of 2011, was it 11? It's been a couple years now, assessed that North Korea had enough plutonium for no more than about 10 nuclear weapons. More recent estimates by others, both in the United States and China, assess that they have enough plutonium for up to 20 weapons, and that this could increase to 100 weapons in the worst case by 2020. I think that's not going to happen, but the people who make these estimates are credible analysts. So one has to say that this is a possibility. And it's a strong possibility that North Korea could develop by 2020 maybe missiles that could hit the United States that would be armed with nuclear weapons. They are developing a road mobile intercontinental ballistic missile. It's never been tested, but in the next 5 years, if they test it and further develop it, North Korea's capabilities are not limited as far as I could see. Even though they are a weak country, they've decided that this is where they're going to use their money and not in feeding their own people. So lack of money hasn't stopped them. Some other means has to be found to stop them, and South Korea is determined to find that means, and so they've pulled out all stops in introducing missile defense, closing down the last remaining economic exchange with North Korea, the Kaesong industrial zone. And because South Koreans are worried that if they don't stop North Korea now, what happens in 2020? They've got to do whatever they can to do so. But whatever they can, well, I mean, is military option available? Most people think not, because Seoul is so close to the border that it could be attacked with conventional artillery in the event of a conflict. But maybe there are other forms of military options involving maritime interdictions or stopping North Korean ships, as I say, interdiction, ships that are laden with illicit materials. I think there are various things that can be done to put pressure on North Korea, and South Korea is exploring all of them.
Thank you very much.
Oh, I'm sorry, hydrogen bomb. No, it wasn't a hydrogen bomb, obviously. That technology is too advanced, and also the strength of the bomb wasn't enough. I mean, it was the same. It was on par with previous tests. So it wasn't a hydrogen bomb, which would have been many times more powerful. But it probably used some hydrogen isotopes of tritium to boost the weapon. So it was probably a boosted weapon that wasn't fully successful. And because it used some hydrogen isotopes, North Korea called it a hydrogen bomb. Whether or not it was a hydrogen bomb isn't the most important question. It's the fact that North Korea is advancing its capabilities and getting more powerful. And if they could develop a hydrogen bomb, that would give them a much more powerful capability. It's why nations have to exert concerted efforts to stop the development, to dissuade North Korea or persuade them.
Yeah, I'd point you to our colleague Michael Element's blog on the ISS website about that, written last week. I'm very sorry, I'm afraid we've run out of time. I'd like to thank you very much for your attendance and your contributions to a really lively discussion. Recording of this will appear on the ISS website if you'd like to refresh yourself on any point. Could you please now join me in thanking Mark?